that is something that influences how you carry on your life. So if this was me giving back to society because of what had happened to my family and I, then it was an opportunity I was willing to grab. It was a cause that I was willing to sacrifice my academics for. If we're able to make way for the coming generation by sacrificing ourselves, our time, laying the foundation, then I think that is where we find our role as young Africans. So who exactly is the system meant to benefit? We really need to sit down as Africans and design a system that really works for us. And let's not be that nation that turns against each other. Let's be that nation that builds each other moving forward.
Hello, Africa. You're listening to 1000 African Voices. I'm your host, allrou C, coming to you from our Johannesburg studios. 1000 African Voices is a program that profiles Africans of diverse cultures who have traveled and lived across the African continent and the world. In this series, we will collect and share stories from all parts of Africa. Welcome.
1000 African Voices.
Hello, Africa, and welcome to another episode of 1000 African Voices. I'm your host, allrou C, and today we're joined by Anisa Mazimpaka, who will shortly introduce herself to the listeners of 1000 African Voices. Hello, Anisa.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I am good. How are you?
Oh, doing really well. Anisa, if you don't mind just introducing yourself to our listeners, who is Anisa Mazimpaka?
Okay, thank you so much for having me on your show, first of all. So, Anisa Mazimpaka is a very bubbly, outgoing, introverted extrovert, as I'd like to describe myself. I am a social justice activist, but I'm also a family person. I cannot stand to see injustice around me. But other than that, I am very outgoing and I'm a people's person, I guess.
No, lovely. And what is an introverted extrovert, if you don't mind me asking?
So, I tell people that I'm shy and my friends just laugh at me because of the stuff that I've done and I still continue to do. I'm a very reserved person, but when needs be and when the situation requires me to act as an extrovert, I do that. But I think my default setting is an introvert, and situations then require me to be an extrovert. So hence those two together, an introverted extrovert.
Okay. I think we'll go into more of that as the conversation continues. I'm interested in just finding out what it is that you do, sort of the platform where you apply your introverted extrovertedness. What is it that you currently do now?
Okay, so currently I'm a postgraduate student. I'm doing my honors in public policy and African studies with the University of Johannesburg. I'm also a contestant on an SABC one show called One Day Leader, which is a leadership reality debate platform. And the activities that we spoke about, my introverted extrovert, is student leader. I've held multiple positions within the Student Representative Council. During my undergrad, I was SRC treasurer, SRC deputy, and I was the interim institutional president at some point. And I always say that I'm actually proud of being a participant in the fees for protests that took place across South Africa during 2015 and 2016-17, which was a struggle of the students coming forward and saying, listen, fees are too high in institutions. Education is a right. Give us our education. So yeah, that's basically one of the situations that required me to come out of, to become that extrovert.
Yeah. I mean, there's so much to unpack there. I mean, you talked about the fees must fall movement. And maybe some of our listeners who are outside South Africa may not be aware of that. So I'm glad that you at least touched on what that was about. For most people, going through university is difficult enough without getting involved in other activities, and yet you felt that you needed to get involved in the student leadership side of things. Why did you feel the need to go into that space? Were you not challenged enough by your courses maybe?
Yeah. So my undergraduate was in business information technology. That on its own is as stressful as you can think. But I feel like, okay, so I was also a prefect back in high school, right? But the university space is something different. But I feel like when I got to university, you get exposed to a world that you never knew about, people living in a way you never thought about. And then you start looking at your life and you're like, but these are things that I take for granted. And then I think I joined an organization, a student organization, and then through that, I began to see that the struggle of social justice, for example, the struggle of education, the struggle of spaces within university or socioeconomic problems are real. I was now looking at people living that. And I said, look, if I can do something about it, if I can be their voice, if they allow me to, then let me do this, you know. And that's when I got involved in the student activism. Also, I think my background is something that always takes me back to, if I'm in a position, like I said, to assist the next person, then that is something I'm going to do, because my background being, well, during the Rwandan genocide, and that is something that influences how you carry on your life. So if this was me giving back to society because of what had happened to my family and I, then it was an opportunity I was willing to grab. It was a cause that I was willing to sacrifice my academics for. I mean, it was very difficult to balance both academics and leadership, but it was something that had to be done. It was something that was greater than me. I couldn't stop myself from doing it, but I'm just glad that I managed to do them both.
Do you think, Anisa, that there is a link between you being an activist now in 2019 and your background, the fact that you were born during the genocide? You made your way from East Africa to settle in South Africa. Could there be a link between that and the person that you are today? I'm sort of asking the kind of impact or influence that all of that had on the person that you are now.
Yeah, it definitely has an impact. It definitely has an influence on the person I've become. I think it shaped my direction in life because I was just born in 1994. My mom gave birth to me just outside the borders of Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And the interesting thing is 2 years later down the line, after living in refugee camps, of course, we came to South Africa as refugees, and South Africa had just gotten its freedom the same time that Rwanda had started war. So I think that's something that I always look at, and like, it's amazing how I was able to conflict to a place of peace. So if this was my calling, for example, a decade down the line for me to the community that I find myself within, then like I said, it was an opportunity that I was willing to grab, and it is definitely something that shaped me. Definitely. I don't think I can remove myself from that. And it's also the whole African aspect where I consider myself, because of what happened, a daughter of the soil, a continental person, where I just don't identify with one country, but with the African continent in general.
All right. In preparing for this show, I've obviously read up quite a bit on some of the work that you do. And the one thing that stands out is that there seems to be this strong link between you and the University of Johannesburg. The fact that you were
Yes.
involved in the Fees Must Fall movement tells me that you
Yes.
care deeply about student issues, and all the work that you've done points to that. What do you
Yes.
think
Yes.
is the role of academic institutions in shaping society, if that's something you've thought about?
It definitely is. Yes, I am a proud product of the University of Johannesburg. It's my academic home. It's where I did my postgraduate and undergrad. So the role of academia, I'd say, is I think we have to reach a point where we recognize that when students speak in spaces like this, it is not from a space of wanting to appear radical. It is from a space where this is where you find majority of the youth of the country, right? So they speak on issues that are impacting them currently and issues that speak of where they come from. So the role of academia, I'd say, is to support these causes, not to shoot them down, but to look into what exactly is it that led to such concerns being raised so that we actually work together to find the solution. And I think that's the role of academia, to assist the students within that space, look at where they've come from, look at where they are currently now, and shape where they are heading towards. And also, just besides your whole protest atmosphere, I think it is also in shaping the future of the country, because like I said, that's where majority of the students, the youth are. So academia is there. It's meant to mold us, of course, with your whole academic information, your whole academic background and stuff. So yeah, it's meant to equip us for the world out there.
So I'm going to ask you a question about the role of young people in leadership as a whole within the political context. But before I ask that, I want to give some context to the question. So I follow, as someone who hosts this show, I'm obviously engaged in African issues. And the one country, coincidentally, that I really follow is Rwanda, led by President Paul Kagame. And the one thing that I've picked up, and I think the world is finally waking up to the fact that the leadership qualities that he has demonstrated in changing the country that was, say, 94 to what it is today, and some of the technological advancements and just the openness of the country to economic activity is world class. But with that, I've always wondered, especially within our continent, what the role of young leaders is, given that, I mean, the average age of an African president, I haven't done the calculations, but I will guess is over 65. What do you think is the role of someone like yourself or of your age group within the African context?
Right, within the African context, like you said, it's very difficult as young Africans to actually break that barrier of trying to climb up the ranks of leadership within the political sphere. Like you said, we'd assume that the average age for a president is around 65. So it becomes very challenging where you as a youth want to change certain aspects, but you have to be in a certain position of leadership, and the current leadership wouldn't exactly have it that way. But I think our role right now is us molding the future. I think our role right now is identifying, for example, injustices of the past, your issues of colonialism, your issues of equality, and addressing those issues before actually trying to escalate to your ranks of powers. So I think that is our role as young African leaders, to understand very carefully what led to the colonization of our continent. What are we doing about colonization, because we find ourselves in such spaces? I think with me, I'd champion an agenda of your whole decolonial aspect. That's where we need to start, because, for example, decolonizing our school curriculums, where we not learn about your Shakespeare's and stuff. In the South African context, we'd learn about your Shaka Zulu, the history of South Africa, where it comes from. So I think it's very important for us as the youth to champion stuff that will mold the coming generation, because it might not be that we get exactly where we want to be right now. We might be the next president. Not all of us can be the next president. Not all of us can go to parliament, but all of us can be part of the change makers to the coming generation. So if we're able to fix problems that we've identified, for example, in our educational system, because an educational system is something very powerful that we probably don't realize. If we're being taught in schools, for example, a curriculum that favors the colonial master, where, for example, we taught about a Eurocentric system and we're not taught about an Afrocentric system, I think that's something that we have to champion. So like I said, if we're able to make way for the coming generation by sacrificing ourselves, our time, laying the foundation, then I think that is where we find our role as young Africans to pave the way for the coming generation, or to pave the way for ourselves within the next 10, 20 years, where we're not just fighting.
I've decided to just look up the average age as you were talking, and it turns out it's 62.
62, yeah, you were close.
Yeah, because Africa has by far the youngest population in the world. So for us to have that statistic and at the same time have a statistic that says the average age of an African president is 62, if something is not right with that.
That's true.
So you're doing your postgrad in public policy and African studies, I believe, but your undergrad grad studies were in business information technology. Yes. What changed between the time you thought you wanted to go into IT and suddenly you realized that perhaps I should redirect my path?
Yeah, it's actually quite funny, because a lot of people are like, but even related. So I also did a postgraduate in IT, right? Because I felt that I needed to do that. But at that point, my parents were obviously pushing my academics. I was also pushing my academics, where I was like, listen, let me just complete this undergraduate, but let me do a postgraduate in something that interests me at this current space in my life, which was shaped by my student activism, my student leadership. That is exactly what led to me doing public policy and African studies, to understand the environment and to understand exactly what leads to certain aspects. So it is my whole student leadership that got me to do this postgraduate. And it turns out that I'm actually enjoying it. My postgrad, I actually walked out with a couple of distinctions in this new field of study that I found myself in, which was very interesting, because it meant that I was just doing something that I love. Not to say that I didn't love IT, but I just found myself in a space where I was now doing something that I love and something that I understood, something that I was willing to lose sleep over. So, yeah.
All right. No, cool. Congratulations on the distinctions. I've been listening to
thank you.
How you come across. It's no mystery why you would excel within that space.
Thank you.
It sounds to me like you're really the right person to ask even deeper questions on education, not only within the South African context, but across the continent as a whole. When, as a young person, you get told that you need to study mathematics and science subjects so that you can move into the engineering space, because those are the jobs that pay more, and if you want to change the world, that's the space you need to move into. But as you get older and you get more life experience, you start realizing that no, actually, the people who really change the world are those that usually come from your sort of Bachelor of Arts space, which I find very interesting. So the engineers will continue changing the world in their own way. But when it comes to shaping public policy, it turns out it's those that have interest in social issues, and they tend to do well. Within the African context, once again, where do you think we maybe have gaps within our education system where we perhaps lagging behind the rest of the world, if we are at all?
Yeah, I think I'm going to sound a bit controversial. Can stop me if I'm contradicting myself, but I think with the whole education sphere in general, I think getting into varsity, you realize at some point that you don't, I think getting an education via an institution of higher learning or your matric, as we call it in South Africa, I think those are just formalities that were put in place. I've come to realize that you really don't need a piece of paper that you've worked for 3 whole years in order to change the world. And that's just the reality of the matter. And I feel like these are, again, it's the system that dictates to us that we should do 1, 2, and 3, but the system is never correct, especially the current system that we're faced with. I don't want to encourage people not to go through these institutions, but at some point you realize that had you not been in a space of your institution of higher learning, for example, you could have done so much more within these 3 years that you were in an institution. Because I sometimes look at people who are not in your institution of higher learning who could excel. But the funny thing is they look at us, people who couldn't get into your institutions of higher learning, and they look at us and they're like, I wish I was in varsity. But the truth of the matter is you really don't need to be in varsity to bring a change to the world. And I think things like your technical colleges, I know in South Africa, that's just what we're currently faced with, where technical colleges are looked down upon. But the truth of the matter is people in those spheres are actually the ones who are bringing change. I feel like this whole formal education is, I don't want to say a myth because it'll sound like I'm discouraging study. But like I said, you don't need a formal education to change the world. If the only form of education that one has received is via the system, then I don't think we're educated enough. If you're able to go through an institution of higher learning without having been impacted by social problems that surround you, I don't think you've walked out there with life lessons. And I think that's what these institutions are meant to prepare us for. I don't know if I've answered your question or if I still need to go into answering your question, but that was just me trying to give you a background of what exactly I think of the educational system, because you find that, for example, again, I'm going to sound controversial, Black students go through to varsity, especially in South Africa. If you look at our racial struggles or racial statistics and stuff, where you find, for example, Black students go through to varsity, they study for 3 years. Youth in general are not guaranteed a job after varsity. And those that do get a job and go to work for the private sector find themselves working for a white child who just has a matric. So that is where I draw the fact that a formal qualification is not really necessary to change the world. But of course, it's a requirement. So those are the dilemmas that we kind of have to find ourselves in. Because again, the fees struggle will speak to your access into institutions of higher learning and who are the people that have access to these monetary funds. And that's my input there.
So as you were talking, I had the biggest smile on my face. The reason being, so I think about these things quite a lot. And the biggest irony, or one of the biggest ironies in life for me, is that you actually need to go to an institution of higher learning to realize that you don't need to go to an institute of higher learning.
It's crazy. It's so crazy.
It is so ironic that if you enroll for a PhD, after you're done, usually you'll be the one telling the world that you actually don't need a PhD to change the world. And yet you needed to go through that first to realize that. So I really hope more and more people will realize that you're right, it's a requirement. However, there are other ways of changing the world or being successful without necessarily going through that path. And once again, we don't mean to discourage those who want to pursue education. It is important, but you really need to be careful on your definition of what education is. It doesn't necessarily need to come through a formalized structure. I mean, I think of people like Michael Dell, Steve Jobs, Julian Assange, Bill Gates. All those people dropped out of university for a reason, and they went on to do really big things. So I really love your answer. But as I said, and you called it, it's a dilemma, it's a catch-22 where you first need to go through the process to come to that conclusion. But I really like your answer. And maybe the structure of education needs to change. At least that's my view, that the world has changed so much, and yet the rate of change within the educational system is not keeping up with the rate of change in the world. And that's just the sad reality.
That's true. I think we also need to speak of the way that our educational system is structured. It's really set up for failure, right? Because I'm not talking about your primary and your secondary now at a tertiary level. For example, getting into varsity is not easy. Getting into tertiary is not easy. And once you're in tertiary, you face so many struggles, right? And then once you get out, you're not guaranteed a job, right? And when you do look for those jobs, they require work experience, right? So I don't know, it goes back to the whole phase where why are we being taught to study for 3 years? And when we do apply for a job, they require 3-4 years of experience, which we were never exposed to. So who exactly is the system meant to benefit? So I think, like I keep saying, I think we really need to sit down as Africans and design a system that really works for us, because at this phase, it doesn't benefit us really. But we need to be within the system to fight the system and hope and pray that we don't become the system.
Oh, lovely. You mentioned colleges in South Africa that are looked down upon, and yet, in my opinion, that is exactly what the economy requires. And those are the people that should actually be earning a lot more than those that just come out of universities with theoretical qualifications. But that's maybe a discussion for another day. You mentioned earlier that you are on a television show, One Day Leader, I believe, on the SABC One channel. Can you maybe talk a bit about that? What is the show about? What is the One Day Leader show about?
So the show is about taking 6 young people from across all walks of life in South Africa and giving them a platform to express themselves. So what the show does, it takes communities to tackle different socio-economic, political problems, from unemployment to drugs to issues like relationships to issues of your public health sector. So we kind of do tasks and we have actual case studies. And then that is half of the show segment. And the other half is where we debate solutions as to how do we tackle such issues that we face. It's a reality debate show. So first eliminations, it's a 13-week series, right? And then from the 10th episode, they start eliminations and to try and filter out and get what they call the One Day Leader. And interestingly enough, the show hasn't had a female winner in its 7 seasons. So that is also one of the, I don't want to say challenges, but one of the motivations to actually continue with the show, with the spirit of not just representing Africa, not just representing other stuff, but also representing women, because women seem to be a bit underrepresented and we seem to, I don't want to say be taken for granted, but we just have to boost our voice out there and let our voice be heard.
Oh, I love that. Let our voice be heard. And for you personally, Anisa, what are you hoping to get from the show? What's in it for you?
So with me, the aspects that I love is the fact that I'm exposed to the rest of South Africa, because I found myself within tackling issues of the student community. I didn't really go out there because I was so consumed by the issues within the student community. So what's in it for me is the fact that I get what the reality really is of South Africans and our current atmosphere. So that's just that aspect of reminding myself that I should not take everything for granted. And I don't know if I'm answering your question.
No, you are. I mean, we've been talking now for about 30 minutes. So I've sort of tried to put myself in your shoes and think of life from your perspective. And as someone who, it sounds like you think about social issues all the time, leadership issues, the challenges that face a society and students in particular, do you not find that it exhausts you at times? I mean, how do you keep yourself going?
Look, it's really exhausting. Hey, it really is exhausting. But I think finding a balance between these are stuff you can't run away from. You can't just wake up in the morning and decide, I'm not going to care about A, B, and C. But at some point, you also have to care about your own mental well-being, because you cannot proceed to help the next person if you're not mentally okay. So one thing that I find that keeps me sane, if I should say that, is keeping my connection with my close friends and my close family and being able to have that sense of belonging. But also, as ironic as it might be, I find comfort within these struggles. I find comfort within helping the next person. So as much as it's draining, but there's that sort of satisfaction that you've helped the next person, you've contributed to change somewhere, somehow. So that is where the satisfaction comes from. Other than that, just switching off my phone, relaxing, looking at the stars, or just laying in bed, or just watching something just to get my mind off of things. I think those are some of the things that keep me sane.
No, I really like that. It reminds me of when you're in a plane and the stewardess will come out and say, always remember to put your own oxygen mask first before assisting others. Without doing that, you are no use. Maybe you talked about maybe watching some, I assume it's TV shows. So I'm sort of keen to understand what someone like you watches when you turn on the TV. What normally pulls your attention?
I'm trying to run away from the fact that I switched on the news channel and find out what's going on in the world. Because that's like me switching off my reality and just looking at it from a TV screen. But other than that, I like watching reality documentaries or movies that are based on real life, because not only do you get entertainment from it, but you know at the back of your mind that this was something that someone went through. So this is something that is not just fictional. It's something that's real. It happened, and the life lessons that you draw towards the end are legit. But one of the movies that I actually loved, my recent one, is, I think it's called Thug Life. I don't know if you've heard about it.
It's called
Thug Life, or The Hate You Give, actually. The Hate You Give.
Adopted from a book by, I forgot her name, but it's a book that's doing really, really well. It's been on the New York Times bestseller for weeks on end. I assume that's the book the movie you're referring to, The Hate You Give. Okay.
The Hate You Give. That's what it is.
Yeah.
Wow, it goes back into my whole life aspect, hey? So it's just interesting when you can look at that being portrayed in a movie. So it's about this whole struggle of finding yourself as an African within the space you're living in. So it's based in the USA, and we all know that Black Lives Matter is a huge thing, not only there but everywhere. But this is what the US was able to champion. So it goes about educating us the fact that just because you're within a certain sphere doesn't mean that you have to lose your identity. So it takes us through a life of a kid, of a young girl who goes to school. She's from a dangerous neighborhood, but she's taken to a top-notch school, which is surrounded by people of top class, different races. There's hardly people of her skin color at that school. So she has to portray a different image until, when people live a life that is not actually them, and you're not really able to speak about your issues of identity because you're trying to conform, you're trying to fit in. So this changes when her best friend is shot by a white policeman. Her best friend was Black. And that just changed the whole perspective to the fact that, listen, just because I exist within a space that might seem safe for me, I'm not safe within the outside, because by virtue of me being Black, that on its own is a weapon. That on its own is seen as a weapon by the next race, for example. So it takes us through that whole journey of finding yourself and being who you are, and not being afraid to stand for what you stand for, standing for who you are exactly. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you should hate the next group. It just means that you should embrace who you are. So that's basically what the movie is about.
Oh, love, that's such a nice synopsis. As we're about to end the show, Anisa, I'm wondering if there's maybe something you wanted to say that I haven't asked. Are there things that you want to say as we wrap up the show?
No, look, I'm covered, but I think just to put my vision out there of it being, let us remember as Africans that we've come a long way. This continent really needs to reclaim itself for itself. Let us work together as Africans, putting out a united front and achieving social justice through education, not just your institutional education, but listening to other people, education that's not written in the textbook. That's the education that I'm speaking about. Whether you're educating people by doing a good deed, whether you're education in all spheres, not just the normal education that comes to mind when we speak of. So yeah, social justice through education. And let's keep doing things that unite us as Africans, something that we will be able to look at in the next 10, 20 years and be proud that we have rebuilt a fractured Africa, because we know Africa is very, very fractured by colonialism. Africans are always influenced to turn against each other. So let's not be that continent. Let's not be that nation that turns against each other. Let's be that nation that builds each other moving forward.
Lovely. And those who will watch the One Day Leader season 7 and maybe want to support you, how do people support you? And additionally, how can people connect with you on the different social media platforms?
Yeah. So the show really, we have voting lines that are opened every Thursday. So if they'd like to support, well, firstly, besides voting, right, because you can vote by SMSing leader 2 to the number 32792. But apart from voting, which is what I always tell people, is switch on the TV, watch it, and listen to what we're saying. And if you're convinced enough, you can either vote. But again, it goes back to the whole social justice through education. If we have said something that changes you, that moves you, then I just hope that it impacts people more than just the whole voting element. But for people who do want to connect with me, and I'm very open to any proposals that come forward in terms of moving the community. My social media handles, my Facebook is Anisa Mazimpaka. Twitter is Anisa_Mazimpaka. My Instagram is the same as my Twitter handle. My email address is mazimpaka3@gmail.com, which is MAZIMPAKA3@gmail.com. And yeah, that's where you can get me.
Lovely. It's been such a pleasure for me to listen to your views on education, on leadership, the Fees Must Fall movement, amongst other things. This has been so educational for me, and hopefully our listeners will have the same experience. So Anisa Mazimpaka, a motivational speaker, one of the top 100 students in South Africa, the former SRC treasurer and deputy chairperson, student tutor and mentor, and I can go on and on. We probably need another show just to go through that list. This has been such a pleasure for me. Thank you for making the time to come lend your voice to our project, the 1000 African Voices Project. So thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really an honor being on your show.
Lovely. Daughter of the soil, take care. Africa is definitely in good hands. Cheers.
Thank you so much. Bye.
1000 African Voices.
You've been listening to 1000 African Voices. Please join us next time as we bring you yet another African voice. 1000 African Voices is produced by Avurengwi C. Sam Ganich is our sound engineer, with our head researcher Jones Maleka. The intro soundtrack for the show is by the legendary Salif Gator from his 1995 album Forlorn. The song you're listening to right now is by Chronix, and the title of the song is Legend. For more information, including the contact details of our guests, please visit us on our website www.1000africanvoices.com. You can also subscribe to our show on iTunes by searching for 1000 African Voices. We are also available on Stitcher. You can find us as well on Podbean, The only thing we ask of you is that you subscribe to our show by logging on to 1000africanvoices.com and click the subscribe button. That helps us grow, it helps us keep producing and bringing to you more African voices. Until next time, Kungana Africa, and take care.
Being an ordinary person doing what's right. Yesterday at the football game, a little girl asked me my name. She said, "Sir, I've seen you before, tell me who are you?" I said, "I am a legend that you never heard of before." She said, "I am a lion, but you never heard me roar. I am a hero that nobody celebrates. But if one person remembers my name, that means on the ocean of fame I'm an unknown sailor. I'm the percussionist playing with the whalers, the one with the shaker, the mover and shaker. My name wasn't on the front of the paper, but me not cater. Much more than the work is greater. Creation glorifies creator. So all deeds done are in the name of my maker. I am a legend that you probably never hear about. Words from the lion's mouth. I am a hero that nobody celebrates. But if one person remembers my name, give praise, that means I made a change. Story of my life, ordinary person just like you. If you take a look inside, you see the great things that people do. We're out here changing lives day and night, day in, day out. BBC don't show it, CNN don't show it. He's out.